Hello and welcome to another edition of Community Forum. My name is Joseph Feaster. I am the host of the program, and I have a special guest to bring to you today. That is a person who is a friend, a colleague, a person whose administration I had the pleasure of serving in. He was our governor from 1975 to 1979, and again from 1983 to 1991, having served as the longest serving governor in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He was our 65th and 67th governor, and I would like to welcome to the program today His Excellency Governor Michael S. Dukakis.
Joe, thank you. It's a pleasure to do this with you.
Well, Governor, thank you so much for honoring me by appearing on the program, and I want to get right into some of the issues that I'd like to cover with you because you had an expansive political career. I just want to do a little bit more by way of introduction because you also served as a state representative for two districts, the 10th and the 13th Norfolk District, having served as a state rep from 1963 to 1971. I know you had your own TV program prior to becoming governor. But I do want to focus upon both your tenures as governor, starting with that 1975 to 1979 timeframe where we had that infamous, now the second largest snowstorm in Massachusetts. You had some specific initiatives that you wanted to pursue during that time, and I would like you to talk about both of your governorships and also some of the things that were of interest to you, like transportation, I know, education, a number of issues. So if you could just tell our audience about some of that, that would be great.
Well, you have to go back to 1974 when this state was heading, Joe, into another very severe recession. In fact, it was much worse in the mid-'70s than what we've just gone through, at least in Massachusetts. The rest of the country took some very serious hits this past time, and it isn't that Massachusetts wasn't affected, but we were really in the depths. We were the frost belt, they were the sun belt. Somebody at some point called us the new Appalachia. I mean, it was that bad. Our industrial base had just collapsed. And particularly in the older urban communities in the state, the old industrial communities, we had unemployment rates of depression levels. I mean, in the 20s. And I remember going up to Lowell in early February when a young city planner named Frank Keefe, at that time, was the city planner in Lowell, and walking around in the slush as Keefe told me about great plans for Lowell. And I got to tell you, you had to be a person of faith to believe we could do anything with the Lowells or the New Bedfords or the Worcesters or the Fitchburgs or any of these older industrial communities. So reviving them and bringing them back and making them healthy communities again was one of my top priorities. The T was a basket case. I mean, the MBTA was a basket case at the time. And turning that into a first-class modern transit system was very important. We had stopped all those highways that were going to destroy the city of Boston, but we needed a public transportation system worthy of the name. The commuter rail system was a mess. It was still being run by private companies. They were terrible. And I subsequently kicked them out and brought Amtrak in to run commuter rail, which it did very, very well. We may want to talk at some point today about what happened after Amtrak's performance. And healthcare was always a very strong issue of mine. And although it wasn't until my second and third terms, as you know, that we really began doing important things and passed, in fact, a universal healthcare bill in my third term. Healthcare was a big issue for me, and one where I simply couldn't understand why Massachusetts and the United States of America couldn't do what every other advanced industrialized nation in the world had done. That was to provide its people with decent, affordable health care. So there was a whole range of issues. Integrity was an issue, you know, because you were at administration and finance where we were dealing with so many of these problems. And, and so it was a very full agenda. We had a terrible deficit. We had the biggest state deficit proportionately in the country, and an unemployment rate, which is the second highest in the country, is at 12%. So lots of problems and lots of issues to get into. And obviously, you and I and a lot of people worked very hard to turn things around. I'd like to think we did that, particularly in the 1980s.
Well, certainly, Governor, as I stated in the introduction, I had the pleasure of serving as your Assistant Secretary and General Counsel in Administration and Finance in your second term, and coming with you in 1983. But I want to begin to just peel back and go in a little more depth on some of the issues that you pointed out. You talked about communities and the reestablishing and rebuilding some of our communities which were suffering. You talked about the T, and we're faced with that issue presently, and and I know transportation was one of your key issues. In fact, you used to take the Green Line or walk to the office anyway. I'd want to talk about the commuter rail, but let's start with the communities that you talked about with Frank Keefe, who was my direct supervisor in A&F, since he was a secretary of A&F. Some of the things that you did, recognizing that the recession or depression that you were talking about in '74 when you were running for office, what are some of the other communities? I know you did things in Lowell. I'm not sure about the Fall Rivers and New Bedfords, but I know you were looking at trying to revive some of the communities in Massachusetts. Can we talk about that a bit?
You bet. Now we're calling them the gateway cities, which I kind of like, but before we called them the gateway cities, as you know, we were deeply involved, and every single one of them I saw as a possible opportunity. So in southeastern Massachusetts, which was chronically depressed, it was Taunton, it was Fall River, it was New Bedford. Up in the Merrimack Valley, in addition to Lowell, Haverhill, Lawrence, and Newburyport, Joe, where when I first went up there as a state legislator in the early 60s, the unemployment rate in Newburyport, Massachusetts was 20%. I mean, you could buy one of those mansions on High Street for $15,000. And a lot of people wanted to tear down the historic downtown and put a suburban shopping center in the middle of it. Today, of course, Newburyport's a gem and thousands of people go there and stuff, but that's what we were talking about at the time. Boston itself was not in the greatest of shape, to put it mildly. Worcester, Springfield, Holyoke, Gardner, Fitchburg. These were the old industrial communities of the state, which at one time had been prosperous, but the state's industrial base had really kind of collapsed. The textile mills had left, the shoe factories had left. Brockton, which was a big shoe town, was really decimated. And so the question was, how does state government use its resources and its leadership to bring those communities back again, while at the same time winning support in the suburbs for that kind of revitalized effort in these older cities? And it was a big challenge. Fortunately, we were able to do a lot of good things. Lowell, of course, was our model, but by no means the only one. And a combination of much better public transportation, connecting those cities to Boston by rail, using our educational institutions. A place like what we used to call, you remember Lowell Tech?
Yes.
And Lowell State, and then we combined it in the University of Lowell before it became a part of the Massachusetts university system. Those educational institutions began to become extremely important, making sure that state investments went into those downtowns. We had been investing state money all over the place, mostly in the suburbs, while these older cities were getting hollowed out. That was important. And it was important in Boston as well as the rest of the state. So encouraging high tech, encouraging biotech, encouraging some of these new industries, but at the same time, as you'll recall, not walking away from traditional manufacturing, where we created, among other things, a center of excellence in advanced manufacturing technology to see if we couldn't help these older manufacturing companies modernize, introduce information systems into them, and become competitive again. Lots of emphasis on international trade, on making Massachusetts a place that could export stuff. I mean, all of that together went into this with a very heavy emphasis on, to repeat, what we now call these gateway cities.
Thank you, Governor, for that. And this is also a learning experience for our viewing audience to learn not only about the great policies that you put in effect during your tenure, but I know you're at the Dukakis Center over at Northeastern University, and that's in the College of Political Science, which was the college of which I graduated from. I want this also to be a political education for us. I'm going to touch on some issues which hopefully they're not too hot button issues for you, but I think it might be illustrative for our viewers. One of them is, I want you to harken back to the election of 1978. I mean, you were doing some great things, moving the Commonwealth forward, and then 1978, you lose the election. Can you talk about what was happening then, what you feel resulted in that occurring? And then, of course, we know the comeback in 1983, 1982 election, and ultimately you're coming into office again in 1983. Could you chat a little bit about that?
Well, I think what happened, Joe, was that after winning the governorship in '74 and walking into what was a very, very difficult situation, we worked hard, everybody worked hard, and slowly but surely that 12% unemployment rate dropped to 5.5% over a 4-year period. At least the makings of this new urban policy were beginning to happen. We were investing in our public infrastructure. We had already begun the job of turning the T around, and boy, it needed turning around, let me tell you. And I was feeling pretty good about things, and I was literally 40 percentage points ahead of Ed King in the polls with 5 weeks to go. And I think one of the things that happened was that people just got very complacent. You know, the first one had been tough, this one was going to be easy. By the way, that was the year that the Red Sox were 14 games ahead at the All-Star break and lost when Bucky Dent hit that home run into the nets in left field. So, as I often say these days, the Red Sox and Dukakis went down the drain together. But I think it was a reminder that you can never take anything for granted. And that's particularly true in politics. And then, as you know, after a couple of years, I decided to run again. I had not, frankly, left office thinking I would run again.
Right.
But the King administration had some real weaknesses, and there were some integrity issues and a variety of other things. And this time, let me tell you, nothing was taken for granted. We had a superb precinct-based organization across the state, thousands of people involved. And I was fortunate enough to beat the guy that had beaten me and go back in as governor in '83. Wiser, a better listener, and frankly, I think a much better governor. And I think it's one of the reasons why we had a much more successful second and third term. So there's something to be said for losing if you learn from it. I don't recommend it as a regular diet. Believe me, it's not fun.
Well, Governor, I was, a part of that. In fact, it was the late Lenny Zakem who introduced us in '82, and I had the opportunity to see you then and then to join your administration. But I just wanted to tell you that I saved a memento from the election in '86. I just want everyone to see it in terms of this was Dukakis in '86. This was in terms of the third term. So I just wanted to tell you, I said, I learned from you for history's sake. I saved my hat. My wife told me don't wear it too long, but I just wanted to bring back that memory once again from that time frame. We talked about the transportation. I want to come back because it wasn't only in terms of rail that you were looking at, because that's also under the tutelage of Fred Salvucci, the Secretary of Transportation. You proposed to the federal government the Big Dig. And could you talk about that as far as your whole transportation mindset, Governor, and strategy, which included not only our highways, but also our rail system?
Well, I've got to go back a ways, Joe, as you know. Coming out of World War II, it was all about automobiles and airplanes. We started pouring billions into the interstate highway system, billions more into airports. But the trains in this country were still being run by private railroad companies, freight and passenger. Freight on the whole continued to do fairly well. But when you had all of this competition from planes and highways, heavily financed by the federal government, 90% of those interstate highway monies came from the federal treasury, only 10% from the states. And nothing really for rail or transit. Not surprisingly, our rail and transit systems began getting worse and worse and worse, still in private hands, by the way. while we were pouring all of this money into highways and airports. And every metropolitan area in the country, including this one, had what was called a master highway plan. In our case, 6 8-lane expressways coming through 128 right into the city. Now, of course, if you did that, you'd have a massive traffic jam at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we were told that we needed an inner belt highway, 8 lanes elevated, down what is now Melniak Boulevard. It didn't exist at the time. Down Ruggles Street.
Yes.
3 feet from the Museum of Fine Arts. I'm not kidding you. 3 feet from the Museum of Fine Arts, right through Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace in front of Simmons and Emanuel. You with me?
Yes.
Across the river, smashing its way through Cambridge and hooking up on the other side in Somerville. And we were told we just had to build that. Meantime, our public transportation system was a disaster. And I was the first guy to get up as an elected official and say, this makes no sense at all. We've got to kill that highway plan and see if we can't pour those resources into a first-class metropolitan transit and rail system, including commuter rail, which was a mess and was still being run by the private railroads. And I finally basically replaced them with Amtrak, which was running the commuter rail system very well for about 20 years until some folks over at the Pioneer Institute decided that we needed to privatize commuter rail. More on that in our discussion. And so, with the help of Tip O'Neill, who was then the majority leader, soon to be the speaker, federal highway laws were amended to permit us and others for the first time to take those interstate highway monies that we didn't want for this master highway plan and use them for public transportation. It had never been done before, Joe. You couldn't bust the highway trust fund. Remember, if it was gasoline tax money,
Right.
It had to be used for highways. We were the first state permitted to use that money for public transportation. We acquired the entire commuter rail system. We went to work and modernized the T, extended down to Braintree, out to Melrose, out to Alewife. I mean, all of that's the Southwest Corridor, which you're very familiar with. All part of this massive expansion, all done effectively with interstate highway money and under the leadership of Fred Salvucci, who was an extraordinary guy, as we both know, and a great Secretary of Transportation. And we spent $3 billion on that rail and transit system. And if it hadn't been for Speaker O'Neill and Senator Kennedy, it never would have happened. So we were very fortunate to do that. And I would argue that killing that master highway plan and investing those funds in public transportation really set the stage for what is now an extraordinary period in the history of Boston. Imagine this city crisscrossed and cut through with 8-lane expressways and more overhead highways and all that kind of stuff. Now, last piece of it obviously was the Big Dig. And Fred was deeply involved in that, as you know. And our plan was not only to eliminate the central artery and put it underground, but to have a double rail line right down the middle of it, which at long last, after 100 years, would connect North and South Station by rail, which is, in my opinion, critically important. That was the original plan, and the Reagan people fought us tooth and nail on that rail connector. Crazy, eh? We ripped up the entire city, and we still didn't connect the two stations, so we still got this 1-mile gap between North and South Station, which is ridiculous. And that was the one piece of this that unfortunately we weren't able to do. I mean, I think most people think that the Big Dig, despite wild overruns into my successors and all of that kind of stuff, still, when completed, it's a great project, but not to use that as an opportunity finally to fully integrate the commuter rail system was just a terrible mistake. But there we are. So we're going to go back at it, see if we can do it now, and I think we must, but it would have been so easy with a city basically totally excavated to do it back then and to connect the two stations.
Well, I think, you know, the foresight, Governor, that you and your team, particularly with Secretary Salvucci, had with the transportation issues have borne out now for the benefit of the citizens of the Commonwealth, in which you talk about the expansions into other communities with regards to the rail system is reaping the type of benefit. I do want to come back because I want to stay on transportation for a minute because I know that, there will be another campaign that I'll speak of, but I want to jump ahead a bit and just talk about, because I know that you served on the national board. I'm not I'm going to say the National Transportation Board. Maybe that was the title, but I know you continue your interest in transportation even on the federal level, even after you left as governor. Can you talk about that a bit? And then you also said you wanted to come back and talk about the whole commuter rail system. So if you could educate us on both of those issues, that would be helpful.
I'll keep this as brief as possible, although they're kind of related. In 1998, the Congress passed an Amtrak reorganization bill, which created a brand new board with 6 new directors. And I was fortunate enough to be appointed by President Clinton as one of the 3 Democrats. There were 3 Republicans. Excellent, by the way, all 3 of them. Became good colleagues and good friends. And we went to work to try to begin to give this country a first-class national rail passenger system. I mean, Joe, what's happening these days when it comes to rail passenger service is really, really pathetic. The rest of the world is going right by us. I happened to speak at a conference in Japan in early April. And so Kitty and I were in Tokyo for a week. The latest Japanese high-speed train, which will be connecting 2 major cities, Tokyo and another city, will hit top speeds of 310 miles an hour. I'm not joking. They already have a system that runs at about 200 miles an hour. And where are we? And by the way, it's not just Japan. It's Europe, it's China, it's countries all over the world building high-speed rail, and where are we? Well, in late 1990s, early 2000s, I was on the board with very good people, and our job was to go out and try to begin to get going on this. And because of what I had done early in my gubernatorial career, Amtrak ran our commuter rail system and did it very well. For reasons I'm not sure I understand, a number of folks on the conservative side, Pioneer and Stoughton, these people started beating the drum for privatization of commuter rail. Now, if you know anything about trains in this country, you know that there are very, very few companies that can run a rail system for you. And you better not talk about privatization unless you've got a lot of folks out there, as you know, who will bid and bid competitively. Well, okay, so the T issued an RFP, a request for proposals. Amtrak, under the leadership of Dave Gunn, who's the best transit rail guy in the country, looked at the bid, and Gunn basically told the T people, hey, this is not biddable. You're asking us to assume risk that is not insurable, and we can't do this, we can't insure it. They kind of didn't care. Gunn, who doesn't suffer fools gladly, basically said, well, okay, if you don't want us, tough. I mean, I'm running a national railroad here. I can't waste time with the T. So Amtrak basically said, that's it, we're out of here. As a result, we ended up with 3 bidders, 2 of which were simply not responsible. And only one of which, run by Jimmy O'Leary, who you know was the former general manager of the T, got the contract at several $1 million in excess of what the T was paying Amtrak. And Amtrak was making a fairly modest profit at the time. So Mass Bay Commuter Rail, as the new company was called, it was a totally new company, ran commuter rail. Not great. Not great, I think we can agree, until last year when the bidding process was opened up again and an outfit called Keolis entered the scene. And they were awarded the contract, and we all know what happened this past winter. Now, you remember the blizzard of '78.
Yes.
Which I think as a storm was worse than anything. You had a tough winter, but in terms of levels of snow and that kind of stuff, I think the blizzard of '78 exceeded what you had this past winter, at least in that storm. The T never shut down. I mean, I think we might have been down for 24 or 36 hours, but thousands of people rode the T during that week when the rest of the state was paralyzed. And that's because we had a terrific team of people under Salvucci running the system. So to watch it kind of collapse this past winter was very painful for a guy like me, and in my opinion, there was no reason for it. Now, the T needs work and it needs leadership. I'm not sure it needs an oversight board. It needs a CEO, and an excellent one. Now, we have an acting CEO who's very good, Frank DePaula. And as you can tell, the T has already shown significant improvement. He wouldn't be a bad guy to run the thing, to tell you the truth, on a long-term basis. But when I start hearing about more privatization at the T, especially from the folks that were pushing it in the first place, all you have to do is look at what happened to commuter rail. We've got to be very, very careful about what we do here. There's no reason under the sun why excellent people can't run the T as a public corporation. They did it for me. They can do it for Governor Baker. But I'm not a fan of boards and commissions. I'm a fan of governors taking responsibility, picking excellent people, and fortunately we had great people. You were one of them. And Salvucci was another. And that's what, in my judgment, the T needs, so that we no longer have anything like what happened this past winter.
I'm going to come back, Governor, to the present time, because I do want to get your take on the present administration as we look forward under Governor Baker. But I want to just step back for a minute, because I want to go back to another political lesson, if you will. And I want to go back to your thoughts as to run for the presidency of the United States. In fact, you were the Democratic nominee in 1988 for that. I wanted to get a sense, and again, these are what I call lesson learned moments, to get what your thinking was in terms of running for it. We know the outcome, what you feel may have affected the outcome in 1988. And what you may have learned from that experience, because you stayed in and then I want to come to Dukakis, the professor, because that is another part of your life. But let's, if we can just harken back to 1988, 1987 actually, and earlier, and ultimately the election and your nomination in 1988.
Well, you know, I had never thought of running for the presidency of the United States, Joe. I was very happy being governor. There's no better job in the world than being governor of Massachusetts. We had done some very, very good things. I think unemployment in Massachusetts in 1987 was 2.4%. 2.4%, think about it. We had a labor shortage in this state. And the state was doing exceedingly well. It was a miracle, to tell you the truth. And it wasn't just you or me or some folks in the State House. I'd like to think we contributed, but it was a combination of all kinds of things, and of really the great strengths and talents that this state has. And I was anxious to serve a third term. I kind of privately decided that maybe 3 terms is probably enough. But there were a number of things I wanted to do in that third term. And then something called the Iran-Contra scandal hit. You remember?
Yes.
And I was just appalled. Vice President of the United States lying to the Congress, documents being shredded in the basement of the White House, laws being broken by people in the White House. I mean, it was appalling. And it was only then that I began thinking about this. Now, I was very focused on winning that third term. Unfortunately, we won it with a lot of room to spare. But it was only after that I started thinking about it. And in fact, I said to folks, look, a number of people started coming to me and that kind of thing. I said, look, I just want to enjoy the aftermath of this victory. I want to spend time with my family. First of the year, I'll start thinking about it. You know, it's 9 to 1 that I'm not going to run. I mean, I really wanted to continue to do my work here. And I said, I'm going to spend, 2 or 3 months basically talking to people and listening to them and asking them whether or not they think it makes sense for me to seriously think about running for the presidency. And I did that. And finally, for a variety of reasons, I said, okay, we're going to run. Recognizing that at that point I was at about 1% of the polls. But we went to work and worked hard and won a great primary victory against 6 formidable candidates. There were 7 of us in the race. And I think people were pretty excited.
I just want to remind folks, those who may not remember, at least the ones that I can recall, Governor, were Jesse Jackson, Gary Hart were 2 of them that were in that race, and I forgot the other
Joe
3.
Biden, Al Gore, Dick Gebhardt, Bruce Babbitt. I mean, it was Paul Simon. I mean, these were good people, and I enjoyed very much campaigning with them and getting to know them and this kind of thing. unfortunately, I made two big mistakes in the final. First, and it was my decision, nobody else's, I made a decision that I was not going to respond to the Bush attack campaign. It turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes I ever made. I mean, if there's a lesson to be learned from '88, it is if the other guy's going to come at you with this stuff, you've got to be ready for it. You've got to have a carefully thought out strategy for dealing with it, preferably one that turns his attack campaign into a character issue on him. And I didn't do that. And secondly, even though, as you know, I'd always won elections with very strong precinct-based grassroots campaigns, I spent too much time talking to people who I thought knew more than I did about running and winning the presidency, all of whom poo-pooed the idea that a precinct-based grassroots campaign for president made any sense. And that was a big mistake. It took Barack Obama not once but twice to demonstrate to all of us that precinct-based grassroots campaigns for the presidency win elections, right?
That's correct.
But unfortunately, I wasn't the guy to prove that. And it was President Obama who in both 2008 and 2012 showed us how you put a precinct-based national campaign together and win. And I think essentially it was those two reasons that led to my demise.
And as I recall, Governor, because I was paying close attention back during that time, that that August of 1980, I guess I would have been in '88, you were well ahead of Bush in the polls.
Yeah. Now some of that was a little artificial because we came out of the convention. You always get a bounce in the convention, and the other guy gets a bounce out of his convention, and so forth. So it's going to be a competitive race. But I think those two issues and those two mistakes really had much to do with the fact that I lost that election. It was a winnable election, no question about it.
You mentioned integrity earlier on, and that is a bellwether in politics now, even more so than it was during your tenure in government. But there were no blemishes in the Dukakis administrations at any point in time. And can, again, for our viewing audience and for us students of politics, can you talk about that, what you put in place to accomplish that? Because there are many politicians who have failed on that account. And is it a personal thing in terms of it being Michael Dukakis and his integrity? Is it the selection of the people that you brought in with you? Help us understand, and I'm sure you're doing this as you speak to your students over at Northeastern as well. Can you talk to us about that whole concept? How do you get an administration with integrity?
Good question, Joe. And frankly, I teach this here at Northeastern. You're absolutely right. One of the things I deal with is how do you set high standards of integrity for yourself and the people who work for you? And it's so important. Now, how do you do that? Well, first, obviously, as I say to my students, plan to live moderately. If you want to make a lot of money, don't go into public service. Get your kicks from the work you do to help others and to make this world a better place. But if you're interested in making tons of money, politics, I'm sorry to say, is not the place for it. And you've got to understand that. Secondly, you've got to take some specific steps. For example, and this is before you came to work for me, but in my first term, we were getting an awful lot of stuff about what was going on in state government. Some of it was accurate, some of it wasn't so accurate. And I kept sending all of this over to Attorney General Bellotti. Frank Bellotti finally came back to me. He said, look, I can't handle all of this stuff. The first thing you've got to do is create a special investigations unit. And he said, and I'll help you do that, which can investigate all of these allegations and determine whether or not there's anything to them. Once they do that, when they come up with cases that look as if they cross the criminal line, then send them to me. In the meantime, as governor, you've got all kinds of stuff you can do to deal with these folks, short of criminal prosecution, suspension, discipline, all those kinds of things. You handle that kind of stuff at A&F. And we did that. So the Special Investigations Unit, which we created with the strong support and involvement of the Attorney General, was absolutely essential. Codes of conduct, Joe, codes of conduct in every agency. A tough conflict of interest law, and as you know, we have one of the toughest conflict of interest laws in the country. places where employees who have questions about whether or not they or members of their family can do certain things appropriately, a place where they can go. And here again, as you know, the State Ethics Commission provides this service to state employees, where if they have some question about either what they're doing or what member of their family is doing, they can go to the State Ethics Commission and get an opinion. And then, you know, setting a tone. And we tried to do that. You were part of this, where, you know, we had goals, we had a mission, and we wouldn't tolerate any of the kind of thing which, frankly, when I first became a legislator in '62, it was all over the place. I mean, this state was one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt states in the country. And I think a lot of my attitude about this had to do with the fact that I came into state government at a time when, look, 5 of the 8 governor's counselors, when I was a legislator in the '60s, went to jail. 5 of the 8, and they weren't the only people. So you get some sense of where I was coming from on this. Now, having said that, you know, eternal vigilance is the price of integrity. And there were a few situations where, quite frankly, my dear wife spotted stuff that I didn't see and said, hey, you better take a look at this. This doesn't look good to me. Or you better, I don't know about this guy. You know, I'm concerned. And so as I say to my students, Joe, these days, listen to your spouse.
For sure.
Sometimes he or she will have, you know, certain insights because they're not that into it as much as you are, and will see things that maybe you're missing. But it's a combination of all of these things. But I have to go back to my original idea, principle, whatever. Public service, as we both know, is a terrific opportunity. I mean, there's nothing like it. To be in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens is the most important privilege you have in this world, in my opinion. And I love being governor, and I can't think, as I say, I think it's the best job in the world. But you also have to plan to, as I say, live moderately. And we've been able to do that, and we've had a great life, and we're still at it, as you know, and still deeply and actively involved. But and it's no great sacrifice. But that's important, and it's very important that whoever's at the top, in this case the governor, convey that sense to people so that they understand where we're coming from.
Well, Governor, I'm sure that, you know, I won't belabor more into Dukakis, the professor, and I'm sure that the students there are learning quite a bit from having you there as a professor. As I offer now, I'd love to come back and you know, do some study under you while you're over there at Northeastern as well. I would love to be able to do that. A topic that is near and dear to both you and I is the whole question of mental health, for one, specifically, but I had the pleasure of serving in the administration both with the late Manny Caballo when we came in 1983, who was your Secretary of Health and Human Services at that time, and then his successor was Phil Johnson. Can you talk to me, because you talked about the healthcare issues that you promulgated during your tenure working with both of those great gentlemen in that position as secretary. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about health, and certainly in terms of mental health? As you know, it's very near and dear to me.
Yeah, well, let me say 2 things. First, I have never understood why it has taken this country so long to do what every other advanced industrialized nation in the world has done years ago, and that is to guarantee its people decent and affordable health care. I've just never understood it. And you know, we've had 4 presidents who tried to do it nationally. Harry Truman, Richard Nixon, with a very good health care bill, which to some extent we copied, and I signed in 1988, Bill Clinton, and finally Barack Obama. And it wasn't until the Obama presidency that we finally got something close to the kind of universal health care system that other countries have experienced as a matter of course for years. Now, don't ask me why. I don't understand this. We did universal health care for seniors, 65 and older. We call it Medicare, as you know, and, you know, try to get rid of it. I mean, it's one of those popular things we've ever done. And think of this country without Medicare. But why we weren't able to complete the job is beyond me until President Obama. And this has been a great achievement. On the other hand, as you know, still being attacked, still efforts on the part of the Republicans in Congress to weaken it, to get rid of it, so on and so forth. Look, 93% of the American people believe that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care. And 80 to 85% of the uninsured people in this country, Joe, are working. They're not loafing. They're not sitting around. They're not on public assistance. If you're on welfare, you get Medicaid. These are working Americans, no health insurance. I mean, I think it's unconscionable. And that's fortunately what the Affordable Care Act has done. But fortunately, in our case, in 1988, I signed the second universal health care bill at the state level in the country. Hawaii beat us all in 1975. And we were in the process of implementing it when I left office. My friend Bill Weld came in, and fortunately he didn't share my views on this subject. And so subsequent administrations did everything they could to delay it, stop it, and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until 20 years later, when Mitt Romney, of all people, was elected governor, that we finally went back to develop a health insurance system which now effectively covers just about everybody in the state, and was the model for the Obama bill. So it was Romney, among others, and by the way, Republican think tanks that produced the model for our system and subsequently for the president, which makes this rabid opposition to this thing even more difficult. Now, what about mental health? Well, something else happened, as you know better than anybody, on the mental health side. After years of trying, Ted Kennedy and Patrick Kennedy and Pete Domenici, a conservative Republican senator from New Mexico, fought and won the so-called mental health parity bill, which now says that if you have health insurance in this country, those health insurance companies cannot make a distinction between health care generally and mental health. As you know, up until this time, mental health benefits have always been less, more restricted, this, that, and the other thing. Now, any health insurance policy in the United States has to provide full benefits for mental problems as well as other kinds of problems, if there is a distinction. Because these days, as you know better than anybody, mental illness is a biological disease. It's largely biologically based. So trying to make a distinction between mental illness and other kinds of illnesses is really just scientifically wrong. And I'm not sure people appreciate this, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, all Americans will now be able to get mental health care if in fact they need it. That's a huge breakthrough. And it's going to make a huge difference in the future of lots of people. Now, why do I feel so strongly about this? Because I think everybody knows Kitty went through 17 years of recurring cycles of depression for no apparent reason. Just started in her early 40s, had all kinds of therapy, antidepressant drugs, and so on and so forth. Nothing worked until a doctor at the Massachusetts General Hospital said, I think you ought to try electroconvulsive therapy. Shock! Although ECT these days, as it's called, is very different from what people saw in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's painless, you're under anesthesia, and so on and so forth. And it is the most successful treatment for severe depression there is. If people watching us and listening to us have a loved one or a friend or somebody who's suffering from severe depression, I hope they'll read Kitty's book and seriously explore electroconvulsive therapy. In any event, ECT saved Kitty's life. There's just no question about it. And these days, she's the co-author of a book on the subject. She does grand rounds all over the country at hospitals. She chairs a support group. And this wife of mine literally is saving lives every day. But I'm not sure yet people understand just what a breakthrough on the mental health side the Affordable Care Act is, with mental health parity going with it. And this should trigger a revolution, really, in the way we treat mental and psychological problems in this country. And it's one of the most important parts of the Affordable Care Act, which I'm not sure yet people quite appreciate.
What I'm taking away from this conversation, Governor, and hearkening back to the time when I served in your administration, are two things. One, I can recall that in everything that you did, you wanted to bring it personal. I remember when we would prepare any type of statements for you, you wanted to make sure you brought it home, you brought it to the personal, and that's evident again in the remarks you've just made about your dear wife, Kitty. Secondly, it's heartening for me to have this program today, is so people can get the correct history of the role that you played in a lot of the things that we're benefiting from now. A lot of people are taking credit for a lot, which is, like they always say, in terms of success has many parents, failure is an orphan. What we have here is a situation where there are a lot of things, you were a precursor for them, and they're happening now. And I'm glad to be able, through this program, to be able to let some of the younger folks, the folks who have a revisionist history, learn exactly what was done during the Michael Dukakis administrations. And I'm just proud to be able to do that here and to be able to be a forum for that information flow.
But just remember, Joe, I didn't do it by myself. I had the best team of people that, in my opinion, that ever served in the State House. You were a part of that.
Yeah. We
have terrific folks out there in the community working with us. And you don't do it without that kind of support. You don't do it without literally thousands of people who pour themselves into this and are part of it. So while I'm grateful for the opportunity it gave me to be the governor of this state for 12 years, it was that team around me, it was the folks out in communities across the state that made it all happen. And frankly, as I said, I can't think of anything more personally fulfilling and satisfying being able to do that with so many of you. And that's, in the last analysis, what makes the difference.
Well, we have about 10 more minutes, Governor, of this program, and I'm now going to turn you, I've had you as talking about your history, I've had you talking about Dukakis, the professor. Now I want to bring you to Dukakis, the political analyst, because I want to talk about the Commonwealth in its current state under the guidance of Governor Baker, who I've known for a long time, and I know you as well. And I would also like to talk about the upcoming presidential campaign, and I think that'll probably allow us, unless there's another topic you wanted to discuss, that'll probably end the program on those two topics. So if you could talk a little bit about your perception of the state now under Governor Baker.
Well, first thing you got to remember, and this is not taking anything away from Charlie, is that there really is no $1.8 billion deficit. It doesn't exist. In case you've forgotten, the folks that succeeded us tried to say the same thing, that we had left Governor Weld with a deficit of $1.3 billion. In point of fact, at the end of my last fiscal year, which, as you know, finishes in June after the former governor leaves, the state had a surplus of $240 million. So, and we're hearing the same thing again. There is no $1.8 billion deficit. You got to budget carefully. You got to make decisions. You got to pick your priorities. But Governor Patrick left the new administration in pretty good shape, all things considered, and, by the way, with an economy which was humming. And that's important. I mean, Deval Patrick put a lot of time and effort into building a strong economy for the state, and he had a lot to do with it. And I think he deserves a certain amount of credit. Now, Charlie's a good guy. He's experienced. He's hardworking. And he's capable. And I think all of us want this state to do well. So I want him to succeed. I mean, I want him as governor to provide us with good leadership. And I think he's off to a pretty good start. I'm a little concerned about this MBTA thing because, I spent half of my political career getting rid of dozens and dozens of boards and commissions, which were not only screwing up state government, but in many cases were sources of corruption and a variety of other things. And in point of fact, those of us in the legislature, Joe, in the 1960s, worked very hard to give governors in this state a cabinet system which would make it possible for them to get rid of all these boards and commissions, appoint their cabinet. As you know, nobody even confirms the cabinet, right? You appoint the cabinet, it goes to work. Um, and we did that because we wanted governors to have the kind of tools they needed and to be held accountable for what happens. And I'm just a little concerned about this current approach to the T problems. Look, the T is the governor's agency, as you know. He has a Secretary of Transportation, and that secretary essentially decides who runs the T. And you don't want to muck it up with a lot of other boards and commissions and characters running around. I mean, the first thing that the governor needs is a first-class CEO to run the T. And it's now July. We're heading for August. You know, the winter isn't too far away. And there still is only an acting MBTA CEO. Now, he happens to be a very good guy. And I'm a big fan of the current guy that's running the T. He was the construction guy at the T. He knows the T. Was an excellent highway commissioner, and I think they ought to look seriously at him as a more permanent TCO, if you will. But no matter what, the place needs a CEO with the authority and the responsibility to get things done, who can then pick his team and put them to work. And I think we've been spending so much time debating these boards and commissions and oversight and that kind of stuff that we've kind of forgotten that the single most important thing that has to happen here soon, should happen months ago, is an excellent CEO who puts together a team and does the kind of stuff that I'd like to think we did when I was governor. And the faster that Charlie can decide who that person ought to be, the better.
The upcoming election, Governor, a lot of candidates on the Republican side. In fact, the largest I've ever seen in my whole study of political science and presidential politics, but nonetheless, and on the Democratic side, very small number. What's your thoughts about the election? You've been there yourself back in 87, 88. What advice would you have for any of the candidates?
Well, you know, Kitty and I like Hillary. I think she'd be a fine president. By the way, not a bad idea to have a woman as president one of these days. But beyond that, and so we're going to be for her, but nobody gets a free ride in this business. And frankly, I think competition will be helpful to her. I mean, you got to win this thing. And she's going to be getting some formidable opposition from the senator from Vermont, and the governor from Maryland, and former United States senator from Virginia, and so on. So I like the idea that we're going to have a contest. But I think she'd be a fine president, which is why I'm going to support her. I'm not sure I can say much to you about the Republican field. I mean, these folks are really an interesting collection, and it'll have to play out over time. But I just don't see in any of them the kind of good sense and wisdom that I'd like to see in the presidential candidate. And on the foreign policy side, these folks are really, off the wall here. I mean, if we've learned anything, Joe, from what's happened over the course of the past several years, it is that American interventionism in almost all cases doesn't work, and as we're now seeing, creates more problems than it solves. And either we get serious about building international coalitions when it comes to dealing with these problems, or we're going to repeat these mistakes over and over again. Look at Libya. Look at Syria. 3.5 million refugees as a result of what's been going on there. Just a terrible mistake, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean that I think dictators ought to be able to roam around the world doing anything they want to do. But if we're going to deal with these problems, we've got to deal with them as part of an international community. I hope we're going to get an agreement with Iran on nuclear proliferation. But the reason we're close to getting that agreement, in addition to the leadership of our friend John Kerry, who I think has done an incredible job on this, is that a strong international coalition, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, have been very much a part of this from the beginning. That's the way you solve these problems. not by running around and getting into squabbles with this country or that country and deciding that this country's an enemy and that country's, China. Good Lord. I mean, when did China become the enemy? I mean, this is ridiculous. But I do think it requires much stronger international collaboration. And I don't see anything in this Republican field that seems to understand that. They want a more muscular foreign policy. You know what that means? More invasions, more intervention. We've had enough of that.
Let me just ask you this, because we're coming towards the end of the program, Governor, and I would just like for you in this political analyst role, what are the issues that you think will be the major issues that the general public is going to be concerned about in evaluating candidates in this particular election? And if you could just tick them off, because we don't have a lot of time, as to what you think those issues will be.
Look, the economy is always the single most important issue. I think Barack Obama has done a hell of a job of bringing us back from the brink to something close to full employment, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for that, despite a lot of opposition from the other side. Healthcare, a huge achievement at long last. The fourth president to try it, and he was successful. Climate change, it's real. We've got climate change deniers around. My response to them always is, go out to Glacier National Park and do it fast, because in 10 years there won't be any glaciers if you don't think that climate change is real. So I think these key environmental issues are important. There are others as well, and this whole business of the United States and its role in foreign policy and building a world, and I'm serious about this, Joe, a world in which war is ruled out as a means for settling disputes between and among countries, I think has to be our goal. How do you do that? You do it by building strong international institutions and being a part of that. Those are some of the things that I want to see us focus on, and frankly, some of the things I want to see the presidential candidates focus on as we go into this presidential year.
Well, Governor, I'm about to run out of time, and I definitely want to thank you. You have honored me by appearing on the program. I know I've certainly learned a lot, and I was there and observed you, but I'm hoping that our viewing audience will also get a sense of who Michael Dukakis was, who Michael Dukakis is, and the role that you have played in the history of this Commonwealth and our nation. So I want to thank you so much, and want to wish you well in your professorship at my alma mater, Northeastern University.
We'll keep producing outstanding young public servants as long as I have breath in my body and can teach them. By the way, I love Northeastern, I love your alma mater, and I love teaching these kids. They're terrific, Joe. They're absolutely terrific, and they're going to be great public servants.
Thank you, Governor, and have a blessed day.
Thank you.